you can't miss the story that has broken recently of a pressing national security threat. And while it seems like it is very dire and serious, when we peel back the onion, we realize that there is a lot more to this than initially meets the eye. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so here's the overall contours of the story, right? You could find this from a dozen different sources. A senior U.S. official, this is House Republican Intelligence Chair Mike Turner, warns of a security threat amid reports of a Russian nuclear capability in space, right? This is the Republican head of the House Intelligence Committee, has called for the Biden administration to declassify information on what he called, quote, a serious national security threat, which was later reported to involve Russian plans to deploy nuclear weapons in space. Right, Turner himself gave no details about this supposed security threat. Now, the ABC News and New York Times was able to get some unnamed sources saying that the security threat Turner was referring to involved Russia's potential deployment of a nuclear anti-satellite weapon in space. U.S. allies had also been briefed on the intelligence, which was not deemed to represent an urgent threat, as the Russian capability was still in development. It's believed possibly to be connected to a February 9th launch of a Soyuz rocket carrying a classified Russian Defense Ministry payload. And that supposedly from the Federation of American Scientists, Russia's been conducting experiments, maneuvering satellites that could be designed to sabotage other satellites. Of course, bringing nuclear weapons into space would violate the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, to which Moscow is a signatory. Right. And as he says, quote, and this is where you see how deep you have to get in the article to even start to peel back a layer. Here's the first one. He says, quote, the issue is not so much about an increased nuclear weapons threat per se, but that it would increase the threat against other countries' space-based nuclear command and control assets. That would be highly destabilizing. And of course, an expert on Russian nuclear forces said, quote, that I am very skeptical, to put it mildly. Unfortunately, it's impossible to categorically rule out anything these days, but I don't think it's plausible. So, right, peeling back a little bit of the onion, we see that there might be something a bit more going on. And when we look over to PBS, they actually have an interview with one of their journalists, Nick Shiffin, who's been following this issue. And PBS has some pretty good journalists. One of basically the only people that still actually employ journalists as a full-time gig. But what I think is interesting about Shiffin is that he points out, let's see if I can find it here, that essentially there is Russian officials, or rather U.S. officials, describe what Russia recently launched, this is off the books, as a new anti-satellite capability, meaning a satellite that can attack other satellites. The officials tell Shiffin that this satellite is possibly nuclear powered and has an electronic warfare capability to target American satellites that are essential for U.S. military and civilian communication. So that is what I thought was, those are two key details that are really left out of almost every other article. Now, here's the thing, guys. When they say nuclear powered, what are they talking about? Well, before, in some of the earliest space probes weren't powered using solar panels, right? Modern spacecraft and rovers are powered using solar panels that kind of deploy out, right? They will often charge up and then kind of run off a limited battery life. And for something like a communication satellite that's just kind of relaying signals back and forth, that's a very effective setup. But before there were very efficient solar panels, what would often happen is instead they would have small generators installed inside them that were powered by literally hunks of plutonium. Famously, at least one U.S. military satellite from like the 50s or 60s actually supposedly crashed in like the Atlantic Ocean. And when a civilian observer asked, well, how did this satellite stay in orbit as long as it did? With what fuel source or battery source? The math told them that it could only be plutonium. And they were like, oh, the U.S. military, did they just dump like 3 kilograms of like raw plutonium into the ocean? The U.S. military couldn't confirm it, but the answer was implied to be yes. The CIA also sometimes, when they used listening devices, again in the 50s and 60s, that would be installed on like mountaintops to interdict like radio signals, those too would often have plutonium batteries, which would give them, because plutonium radiates literal heat and for hundreds of years, potentially, those were a great power source for long-term listening devices. Of course, the problem is, they're extremely radioactive, very, very hazardous. And so when they say a nuclear-powered satellite, that's likely what they're referring to. Probably Russia has decided that it is simply much more efficient and reliable to, instead of depending on solar power, which may not even perhaps have the generative capacity to actually perform the maneuvers to target a U.S. satellite, that instead they need a little more juice, and so a small generator powered by a highly radioactive core is used. Now, is that still a nuclear weapon? Technically, yes, right? But let's be honest for a second here. Here's what it's not. It is not going to be dropping a nuclear weapon onto New York City or your hometown. And it is not going to be an EMP weapon, right? It's not going to detonate above the earth and short out all electronics and cause some kind of disaster. In fact, it is unlikely to even be explosive. And the reason is because when you start blowing things up in space, you create basically a giant shotgun that, or think of it like a bomb that never stops exploding. That's the problem when you create a bunch of space shrapnel, is that it just flies out in every direction. And Russia also has military satellites. So what it wouldn't want to do is create two satellites that, boom, blow up together, right? And because there's no air friction, that debris, that shrapnel is going to fly outward forever, and it's going to get caught. It's already in like geosynchronous orbit, so it's just going to get caught there. It's going to spin around the Earth, literally an artillery shell that never stops exploding. And it's going to take out space stations, civilian satellites, military satellites, Russian satellites, US satellites, Chinese satellites. And boy, oh boy, if you want to become an international pariah, just destroy all space satellites with your idiot fucking program. And the Russians are impulsive, but they're not stupid. And they know this, right? So what they appear to have built is a satellite killer, something that can probably position itself close to a U.S. military or civilian communication satellite and short the thing out. Again, probably using some kind of electronic warfare system that the plutonium core of that satellite is unlikely to be affected by. So then you're left with another question. Why would this, well, certainly the U.S. military really does. This is a serious issue if you're the U.S. military. Remember, our vehicles depend on the GPS system. In fact, our aircraft depend on the GPS system, military satellites. We see in Ukrainian soldiers relying on Starlink internet to ensure continuous coverage of the battlefield, really enabling them to take information warfare to the next level. You have tons and tons of military satellite communications, right, on the tactical level. When I was in Afghanistan 10 years ago, oh gosh, it was 14 years ago, even then, we had a satellite radio that literally there was one channel for the entire RC, the entire region. So you had to literally, basically, it was emergency use only. So you would continuously only hear soldiers in the mountains in like critical imminent firefights breaking onto the net and asking for help. So I say this because the question that we're now stuck with is why would a U.S. senator suddenly create a panic, right? And they're certainly doing their best here to create that panic. First off, the Mike Turner, right, is coming out and asking Biden to declassify information on what he called a serious national security threat. Now, Turner knows full well that the Biden administration is not going to do that, because to declassify the information about the threat would enable Russia to identify where the threat was leaked from. For example, let's say the U.S. Got technical specs of this satellite 2 days before it launched. Well, then they would know, the Russian government would know, hey, we need to see who had these technical specs and who had access to them at this time? How updated are they? Right. So if you know that it's the version from 6 months ago, then you go, okay, well, who do we fire from the program 6 months ago? You see, that's the kind of counterintelligence you have to always consider when you're releasing sources or when you're releasing your information, that it may imply sources and methods. So he knows that's not going to happen, but he does want to tell the U.S. public that it's a serious national security threat. And then he leaks that it involves nuclear weapons in space, which is technically true, but probably not actually true, right? Now, the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan expressed surprise at Turner's statement, saying he was due to meet with the Gang of Eight, a high-level congressional leaders, on Thursday, right? So it's interesting because, again, this is not, if this were a literal nuclear weapon pointed at New York, you would not wait until later in the week when your schedule opened up to have this meeting, right? So why then would Republicans come out and try to create hype, right? They also say things like, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson comes out and tells people, don't panic. Guys, everyone knows that when an elected leader comes out and tells people not to panic, it's baiting them to panic. And again, you leak this stuff about nuclear info and nuclear weapons, and it sounds really scary. I think the real story is this. I think that the Republicans want to essentially scare the U.S. public by creating this perception of a salacious, crazy threat from Russia, and it'll make them scared to support our allies like Ukraine, right? It sounds crazy, but the Republicans have been staunchly anti-Ukraine, especially House Republicans, and have been trying to kill this Ukraine bill. And basically, because it's a standalone bill, and Ukraine aid is extremely popular among the U.S. public, the only way to get them to pivot is to create the perception that aiding Ukraine would put Americans in imminent danger. And by manufacturing a minor piece of, a slight extra tool or capability of the Russian military and blowing that up into something that's going to sound like America's worst fears, is going to make them less likely to oppose Russia and more likely to appease Russia. You also, of course, the reason Jake Sullivan, I don't think this is a big deal, is because imagine you're a UFC fighter and you do a pre-fight interview, go on somebody's podcast and you say, man, my opponent, I am terrified of his left hook. He has a beautiful left hook and I am just so afraid he's going to knock me out, right? What would that tell your opponent? That would tell your opponent that basically you should spam that left hook, that your opponent's going to be terrified of that left hook. That is not what you want to do, right? Russia may be researching a game-changing capacity, but if the U.S. publicly says, hey, Russia, this is something that is a huge threat to the United States, it would really destroy our capacity if you implemented this. Now Russia's going to double down on building those systems, right? There's so many systems out there that are experimental, and Russia's the king of gee whiz technology that they never really bring to maturity. But by telling Russia explicitly that this is a serious threat and it's a big deal, that he's signaling to Russia that they should double down on this program because it's a real threat to the United States. And I don't think even someone as foolish as a Republican House member is going to say those things. I'm talking smack. But I think some of these guys are idiots. And even if you're dumb, I don't think anybody's that dumb. Right. I think they are doing a classic scheme of taking a minor national security issue that should be just like a Tuesday afternoon briefing to keep key members aware of something. And they're trying to turn it into something that'll turn Russia into a big, scary boogeyman. Okay. So anyway, guys, that's really all I had. If you are interested in, of course, bringing your own secret weapon, your own special capacity to your personal goals anyway. You're working out, you need more energy to crush it at work, whatever it is, you want to check out Strike Gum. Strike Gum, 90 milligrams caffeine, 0 sugar, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, maximum mental clarity. Check us out, strikegum.com. We got new customer discounts. We got veteran and military discounts. So check us out, man. It's great. And that's really all I had. Other than that, guys, be sure to hit like and subscribe on the video if you appreciate this kind of analysis. Thanks to our Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com. Thanks to our Lieutenant tier members. And I'll see you guys in the latest video that's dropping later today. See ya. Cheers.